All right. Hello, everyone. So before we get started, Third Place Books would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the Duwamish people and the land itself. So welcome everyone to our virtual event space. My name is Allie. I am a bookseller at our Lake Forest Park location, and I'm your host for this evening. I am so excited to be introducing Julie Sedivy and Michael Spivey here to discuss Julie's book, Memory Speaks, on losing and reclaiming language and self. But before we get into the good stuff, on behalf of all of us here at Third Place Books, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. For those of you who may not know, we are an independent bookstore with 3 locations in the Seattle area. And as much as we miss having these events in our bookstores, it has been such a delight to expand this online program to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and for buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So for those of you in the Seattle area, come on in. All 3 of our locations are open, or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local, we of course do ship. So if you haven't gotten your hands on a copy of the book and you would like to, go ahead and follow the link that I will be posting in chat shortly. While you are over on our website, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up in the next few months. And if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our online book clubs, and of course, follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. Speaking of social media, if you would like to check out some of our past virtual events, you can find them on our YouTube channel, including this event within the next couple of days. So if you'd like to see our other virtual events or share this one, go ahead and track us down over there. So we are here for about an hour, and towards the end, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or bottom of your screen. It is different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. I absolutely invite you to share where you're tuning in from in the chat. But when it comes time for questions, go ahead and make sure those end up in the Q&A so we can most easily find them. So before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone of our commitment to ensuring the safety and well-being of event attendees and guest authors. So in our chat and question spaces, please do lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. There are auto-generated closed captions available from the menu at the top or bottom of your screen. Go ahead and select the live transcript button to enable or disable them. And finally, should any technical issues arise, we will work as quickly as we can to resolve them, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. All right, so it is time for all of us to settle in, because without further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce Julie Sedivy, a language scientist and award-winning nonfiction writer whose work crosses and recombines scientific and literary genres. She has taught linguistics and psychology at Brown University and the University of Calgary, and made appearances as a media commentator on CBC and NPR. She's written everything from scientific essays to textbooks, and her work has appeared in Nautilus, Scientific American, Discover, and the popular blog Language Log. Her books include Waiting, an anthology of essays, Language in Mind, an introduction to psycholinguistics, and of course, the book of the evening, Memory Speaks, on losing and reclaiming language and self, which blends memoir and science writing to explore themes of language, loss, multilingualism, migration, and personal identity. Joining us in conversation this evening, I'm so pleased to welcome Michael Spivey, a professor of cognitive science at the University of California. He has published over 100 journal articles and book chapters on the embodiments of cognition and interactions between language, vision, memory, and motor movement. His most recent book, Who You Are, explores the idea that mental activity takes place not just in the brain, but also in the body, and even in the relationship between the body and environment. So thank you both so very much for being here. I am so excited to listen in on this conversation. If you need anything, give me a shout. I will be listening. And the same, of course, goes for all of you in the audience. I will be in chat. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our authors. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ali. I really appreciate the invitation to speak at Third Place Books. You know, it's a little bit of a miracle to me that during this pandemic, books are getting written and published at all. And I know that independent bookstores like this one have played a really outsized role in keeping readers and authors connected to each other. And a huge thank you to Michael for joining me here tonight. Not all of our listeners will be aware, but Michael and I have a very, very long history. We've known each other since our early 20s when we were graduate students together. I wrote my very first academic paper together with Michael, and our early scientific careers were very closely intertwined. So it's just such a pleasure to join forces once more. It's been a while. So thank you for joining me.
It's an honor.
I would like to take a moment to acknowledge some of the difficulties of the past couple of years. It's been a time of incredible losses for many people. In many ways, this book has come out of a sense of loss. And I felt that it was a way to honor my own father, who died a number of years ago. This past year, I've also lost my brother, and I know that, Michael, you've lost your father very recently. So I'd like to dedicate this evening session to them and to anyone else that people have lost, those of you who are with us tonight. We're holding them all in our hearts today. With that, I thought I would start the evening by reading you a short passage from the book, actually the first couple of pages. And while I do that, I'm going to take you into my family album and show you some pictures of some of my early life and family. So just bear with me and I'll get my screen starting to share here. All right. My father died, as he had done most things throughout his life, without preparation and without consulting anyone. He simply went to bed one night and was found the next morning lying amid the sheets like his own stone monument. It was hard for me not to take my father's abrupt exit as a rebuke. For years, he'd been begging me to visit him in the Czech Republic, where I'd been born and where he'd gone back to live in 1992. Each year, I delayed. I was in that part of my life when the marriage, grad school, children, career, divorce current was sweeping me along with breath-sucking force. And a leisurely trip to the fatherland seemed as plausible as pausing the flow of time. And now my dad was shrugging at me from beyond. You see, you've run out of time. His death underscored another subtler loss, that of my native tongue. Czech was the only language I knew until the age of 2, when my family began a migration westward from what was then Czechoslovakia, through Austria, then Italy, settling eventually in Montreal, Canada. Along the way, a clutter of languages introduced themselves into my life. German in preschool, Italian-speaking friends, the francophone streets of East Montreal. Linguistic experience congealed, though, once my 5 siblings and I started school in English. As with many immigrants, this marked the time when English became, unofficially and over the grumbling of my parents, especially my father, our family language. What could my parents do? They were outnumbered. Czech began its slow retreat from our daily life. I entered kindergarten knowing only a few words of English. Upon ascending to first grade, I was mortally offended when my teacher, taking inventory of the immigrant kids in her class on the first day of school, asked me, "What about you, Julie? Do you know a little English?" Indignant, I announced in what I'm sure was still a thick Slavic accent, "I don't know a little English, I know a lot of English." A few years later, no teacher could distinguish my speech from that of my native-born peers. Today, people who know me are startled to learn that English was the fifth language I learned to speak. So thoroughly has it elbowed its predecessors aside. Many would applaud the efficiency with which our family settled into English. It's what exemplary immigrants do. And to me, at that time, the price of assimilation was invisible. Like most young people, I was far more intent on hurtling myself into my future than on tending my ancestral roots. And that future, it was clear, was an English-speaking one. In my world, Czech was a small language, spoken only on our tiny domestic island by people genetically related to me. English was the big, horizon-hungry language, the language of the teachers I adored or had to appease, the language of the TV shows my friends endlessly rehashed, of the books that held me in thrall, and the books I thought I might one day write. It was the language of dreams and goals. But there was a price. As my siblings and I distanced ourselves from the Czech language, a space widened between us and our parents, especially my father, whose English sat on him like a poorly tailored suit. It was as if my parents' life in their home country and the values that defined that life didn't translate credibly into another language. It was much easier to rebel against them in English. Even the English names for our parents encouraged dissent. The tender Czech words we had used, maminka, tatínek, are impossible to pronounce with contempt, but they have no corresponding forms. In English, the sweet but childish mommy and daddy are soon abandoned for mom and dad, words that we discovered lend themselves perfectly well to adolescent snark. I've wondered recently whether things might have been different for my father had his children remained rooted in their native tongue. Over time, we spoke together less and less. I remember watching him grow frustrated at his powerlessness to pass on to his children the legacies he most longed to leave: an ardent religiosity, the nurturing of family ties, pleasure in the music and traditions of his region, which I'm now ashamed to say we often mocked, and a tender respect for ancestors. All of these became diluted by the steady flow of our new experiences narrated in English, laced with Anglophone aspiration and individualism. As we entered adulthood and dispersed all over North America into our self-reliant lives, my father gave up. He moved back home. For the next 2 decades, I lived my adult life, fully absorbed into the English-speaking universe, even adding American citizenship to my Canadian one. My dad was the only person with whom I regularly spoke Czech. If phone calls every few months could be described as regularly, and if my clumsy sentences patched together with abundant English could be called speaking Czech, my Czech heritage began to feel more and more like a vestigial organ. But loss inevitably clarifies that which is gone. When my father died, and with him, my connection to Czech, it was as if the viola section in the orchestra had fallen silent. Not carrying the melody, it had gone unnoticed, but its absence announced how much depth and texture it had supplied, how its rhythms had lent coherence to my music. In grieving my father, I became aware of how much I also mourned the silencing of Czech in my life. There was a part of me, I realized, that only Czech could speak to, a way of being that was hard to settle into, even with my own siblings and mother when we spoke in English. I suddenly felt unmoored, not only from my childhood, but from the entire culture that had shaped me. I've been thinking about that loss ever since.
That's beautiful, Julie. I remember reading those first few pages of your book, and I could hear your voice, and it sounded just like what you just delivered.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if we could start some of this conversation on comparing not just individual language loss, as the book starts out with, but also as the book then moves into language death, the loss of a language in a whole community, and see how that connects from individuals' experience to that language loss with a whole society's experience of that language loss.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it was the emotional response to the loss of Czech that I felt at the time that really prompted me to think in a different way about language death and the extinction of languages, which I'd always, as a linguist, appreciated on an intellectual level. But suddenly I had just the slightest inkling of what it might feel like to be utterly disconnected from your past and the culture from which you came. I write in my book that language death is in some ways the result of children like me. And what I mean by that is that the shift that I made away from Czech in my own life, in a way, kind of scales up to the whole phenomenon of language death and language extinction. Except for the very rare circumstances where an entire population is wiped out due to genocide, for the most part, languages die off because of bilingualism. People make a shift as a population from one language into another language and stop speaking their ancestral language. Ironically, bilingualism is probably our best hope now for preserving many of the world's languages. So if you look back through much of human history, the thousands and thousands of languages that have been spoken were kind of distributed very widely around the globe. But now we have a situation where the vast majority of the world's population speaks one of a small handful of languages. And these languages have disproportionate influence. So why do I say that bilingualism is the cause and salvation of language death? Well, because when you add a language into a mind, we all know that it's possible for people to be bilingual. You don't have to necessarily give up one language in favor of another. But I think it's a lot like adding a child to a household. Well, many households exist perfectly happily with multiple children. I was one, a very large household. But we all know that you have to strike a balance between the needs of the children. And what happens with the world's minority languages now is that they tend to get neglected. So it would be a little bit like you add a new child to the household and you don't treat the children the same. One child gets sent to school. One child is given all kinds of opportunities, is sent to special enrichment programs, is given career opportunities, and the other child is stuck at home, maybe in the kitchen. So many immigrants have this term for the language that they speak as the kitchen language. And that reflects the fact that they speak it in a smaller and smaller set of circumstances. And as a result, they lose the competency to speak it in a wide variety of settings. And that's the beginning of the shift into another language.
I think that's an excellent analogy of adding a child to the family, because I think a lot of North Americans are quite comfortable with choosing English and letting other languages get backgrounded and maybe even fade away. Whereas if you told them this analogy and said, think about it being a child, they would be horrified at the idea of treating that additional child unequally. But that's what it is. That's what's happening to these languages when they try to coexist in a lot of situations, especially with a very dominant language like English. It's going to just take the foreground and leave that other language struggling.
Yeah. And I think what people don't appreciate is just the enormity of the pressure that runs against the minority language. So, you know, a number of our listeners, I think, are in Canada. And in Canada, we can be a little bit smug, if you hadn't noticed. And many people think of Canada as a multicultural country where we think we embrace and tolerate multiple languages. But one of the things I hope my book accomplishes is getting across the idea that it's not enough to simply say, oh, we're fine if you speak your language, that without much more active support, just taking a passive, tolerant position is not enough to support these languages. They really need a tremendous amount of attention in the form of schools in which children can be educated within a language so that their language skills can grow in that heritage tongue. Settings in which that language can be used publicly and so on. And without that kind of attention, those languages simply will not thrive. So Canada doesn't have actually any better of a record than the US in terms of maintaining immigrant languages across generations. In both Canada and the US, immigrants tend to shift away from their languages within a couple of generations, 2, 3 at most.
Yeah, you see that in California as well with Spanish. Yeah. Spanish is spoken by many, many people in California, but it has not become prominent enough on the radio all the time, or on news, or in government. It's still treated as a second-class language, in a sense, even though it's spoken by many, many Californians. Here in the Central Valley, I know many people who are natively bilingual with Spanish and English, and they grew up speaking both in the house and outside, with friends, with family, at school. The one thing is, it's still the case that, especially at school and in sort of formal settings, English is given priority and Spanish is sometimes frowned upon. My own wife, who grew up here in the Central Valley of California, she's Latina, and she grew up in the 70s and early 80s with a family that could very well have made it easy for her to become natively bilingual in English and Spanish. But she and her brother both saw that at school, teachers and other students were dismissive of kids who spoke Spanish. In some cases, it was kids who spoke Spanish natively when they were struggling to learn English, and those kids were not included because they weren't good enough in English. But that kind of that disparagement of speaking Spanish at all led both her and her brother to not take up speaking Spanish, even though the environment would have made it really easy for them to be natively bilingual. They didn't want to have that stigma attached to them of, oh, you speak Spanish at all?
Right.
That puts you in this weird category. And so to this day, she could have been natively bilingual, and she's reasonably fluent with Spanish, but definitely not native sounding.
Yeah, and that story is much more common than people realize. I think, you know, there's a little bit of a sense of threat that many Americans feel when they look at some of the statistics that show that there are a very large number of Spanish speakers within the US. So I think at this point, the number of Spanish speakers in the US exceeds the entire population of Canada, and it has been growing over the last few decades. But what I think isn't appreciated is that that's not the result of families passing Spanish on through the generations. That's the result of new Spanish speakers arriving. Within the families themselves, they make that shift in many cases as quickly or almost as quickly as speakers of other languages, despite the fact that they find themselves in environments where there are many, many, many Spanish speakers around them, and where Spanish is often spoken in public places. So I think that there's an underappreciation of how hard it is to be a minority language, even in large numbers. And part of the goal for this book is to try to understand what those pressures look like. And if you think of it, you know, in relating it back to the issue of language death, in Spanish, in the United States, Spanish is as strong as it is because there's this constant renewal of the population coming from Spanish-speaking countries. But many minority languages, for example, the indigenous peoples of North America don't have a source of that kind of linguistic replenishment. If the language isn't passed on through the generations, it's gone. So they're facing many of the same pressures, but without the possibility of replenishing the sources of that language. And these pressures begin in childhood, right? You alluded to your wife feeling that sense of stigma. And there have been, really interesting studies that have been done showing that people absorb the stereotypes that are associated with their languages. The classic studies were actually done in Quebec, where I grew up, where researchers got some perfectly bilingual speakers were reading passages, direct translations of each other, either in English or in French, and then asked listeners, both Anglophone and Francophone, to judge the voices in terms of various character traits. So how intelligent did they sound? How attractive did they sound? How trustworthy, and so on. And on just about all of the measures, not surprisingly, the English speakers judged the French speakers to score them more poorly. But what really surprised the authors of the study was that the French speakers also judged the French-speaking voices more harshly than the English-speaking voices. They were the same voices. They were exactly the same voices. The only difference was that they were speaking French rather than English. These kinds of studies have been replicated in many locations, including the United States, with respect to Spanish. And they really kind of document the stigma and the stereotypes that people associate with their languages. So it's not surprising that there's a shift away from them.
Yep. That example for me is a beautiful transition for me to point out to listeners that your book does exactly this, flowing from personal experience stories and then weaving in scientific findings, describing the studies in enough detail that a reader can understand. And so you get a mix of the science and the personal experience, and then back to personal experience. This blending is one of the biggest strengths in your book that I really enjoyed and found great value from. I'm used to reading lots of scientific books that just go, here's a finding, here's a study, here's another study. And having that interspace with personal experience makes it feel so much more real, and you can recognize that this is a phenomenon that's happening across many people, and the statistics and data analysis and experiments show that, but it's also a phenomenon that happens in each one of those people, and hearing one person tell their story about it is amazing, actually.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me as I started to read the literature is just how much my experience kind of mapped onto so many studies. And so it really made sense for me to describe how it feels to have those experiences, because I realized that that experience was being replicated many, many, many times over in many households across many different language groups. And I think recognizing the commonality of these experiences to me is actually something that has the potential to unify us, in our attempts to create a more complete and integrated identity. So yeah, thank you for that.
Sure. Julie, there's an intriguing question in the Q&A. If you as a scientist, a cognitive scientist and a linguist might find it interesting. It's about Esperanto. And so Ian Fitzgerald asks, what are your thoughts on Esperanto as a historical example and as an idea?
It's so interesting because, Esperanto kind of reveals this utopian view that if we all speak the same language, there will be greater harmony amongst us, right? And this goes back to like biblical times with the story of the Tower of Babel, where the proliferation of languages was seen as the source of discord. I think from a linguist perspective, the idea of an Esperanto is simply not realistic because of the degree to which language is tied to social identity. Throughout, humanity's existence, language has been such a powerful marker that reveals who raised you, where you came from, especially, in the days where languages tended to be spoken by fairly small communities. There are speculations that there used to be actually many, many, many more languages in existence than are spoken today, and by much smaller language groups. You might, there's even a suggestion that language is more powerful than race as a marker of group identity. And children, in fact, seem to respond to language as if it were something that is a permanent part of you. So there are these fascinating studies that suggest that children are more ready to believe that a Black person can grow up to be a white person than that a French-speaking person can grow up to be an English-speaking person. They seem to come to the world primed to see language as a way of creating very important social distinctions. And we use language that way. So Esperanto kind of reflects the idea that we can all communicate with language as if it were a tool. We can all converge, but it ignores the fact that for us, language isn't just a tool. It's a way of containing the social experiences that are really important to us, and they're not interchangeable with each other. So no, people are not rushing to abandon their mother tongues in favor of Esperanto. Why English is having the power it is because of its ascendance to the importance it has culturally around the world, and the fact that young people aspire to be like the Anglophones that they see portrayed in the media and in the world around them. So that identification piece is very, very powerful, I think. I don't know anyone who's ever said, oh, Esperanto speakers are so cool, you know? Well, I'm sure there are nerdy people who say that, but it's restricted to a fairly small subculture.
Yeah, Klingon speakers probably.
And Klingon speakers.
They think they're cool.
That's right, that's right, yeah.
Do you want to take another question from the Q&A?
Sure.
Cheryl Melnick asks, my grandparents actively dissuaded me from learning Ukrainian due to the racism they experienced coming to Canada. Might you comment on that?
Yeah, this unfortunately is an experience that's so common to many people of my generation and even younger. It's especially common among Indigenous people who experienced tremendous discrimination for speaking their languages and even active punishment in the times when they were separated from their families, sent to residential schools or boarding schools, and were sometimes very harshly punished for speaking their languages. To this day, I encounter many Indigenous people who tell me that they feel an active inhibition in speaking their language, especially with a white person, because they associate it so strongly with a sense of being censured or punished. And I think some of those attitudes, at least for immigrants, have softened somewhat. But in a way, they've just become a little bit more implicit. You know, I still witness in my daily life occasions where people will hear someone speaking another language in public and will say, why can't they speak English? As if the family speaking their own language amongst themselves is a sign of their refusal to adapt to English, when in fact, you know, as we know from all of the evidence, assimilation is swift, it's brutal, it's often complete. They need no further discouragement from speaking their own mother tongues.
There's another question in the Q&A. At what point in your education, from Billy Furiucci, at what point in your education did you realize that making a study of language acquisition and maintenance was your mission in life?
Oh, well, I think one's mission in life changes as you go along. I was always fascinated by language. I think that probably came in part from the early exposure I had to many different languages and thinking about language quite actively. I think I was very attracted to the scientific study of language, because what better way to become more intimate with something that you know, something that you love, than learning much more about it. So I kind of became absorbed in the scientific world. And this book to me actually is a really important milestone, because to me it represents kind of a unity of my life as a language lover, as a reader, as a writer, together with my life as a scientist. So this to me is a place where I take those two sometimes competing cultures and put them together in one book. So it's a very important book for me.
One of the key aspects in the book that I find so compelling is your discussion of how any given language is not merely a tool for sharing the concepts and ideas that all of us already have in our minds, but in fact, when you grow up in a particular language, it shapes the kinds of concepts and ideas each person has in their mind. So if I'm using one language and someone else is using a different language, it's not just the same ideas getting translated into different transmission medium, but it's different ideas from the get-go because they were formed with a different language, and different languages have different ways of shaping your categories for seeing the world. And so one of the sad and powerful parts of your book is talking about how you have this lingering memory of learning Czech as a toddler, as a way of seeing the world through the lens of a Czech language. And then quickly that was taken away from you and you had to learn English, which does definitely see the world a slightly different way. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that in more detail for the listeners who want to read this book.
So yeah, this is another sense in which my own feelings kind of resonated with a lot of what I read, and also much of what I've heard from other bilingual people who've grown up between cultures. The feeling that they have that they're almost different people in each of their languages, that they have slightly different personalities. It turns out that this has actually been attested. So studies show that if you take a personality test in one of your languages, your responses will be somewhat different than if you take the personality test in your other language. So there's some linkage between a sense of identity and a certain set of traits in those languages. So of course, it's a really interesting scientific question as to what underlies that. And, you know, many people will make kind of offhand remarks saying things like, oh, Italian is such a romantic language, or French is such a rational language, or whatever. And, you know, a linguist will kind of look at that and go, okay, tell me, what is it about Italian that makes it romantic? Is it the vowels? Is it the grammar? You know, like, please elaborate. And I think it's much more the fact that we have different lived experiences in each of our languages. So it's certainly true that languages within themselves have different ways of encoding concepts, and their grammars might highlight certain aspects over others. But I think that what's responsible for that feeling of being split between languages and personalities is that the life you lived in Czech is different from the life you lived in English. The life I lived in Czech was a domestic life. It was within the intimacy of my family setting. It was not lived in public places. My English life was much more public. It was, it had a very different set of social contexts. And I think that this is what gets activated when we use each of those languages. I know even when I speak to my own family, my mother, for example, that when we make the shift between languages, it brings out different aspects of our relationship with each other. And when I speak Czech with her, I suddenly feel like I'm, you know, cuddling up with her. I'm my child self. I am transported to that aspect of our relationship, that time when she spoke to me in Czech. And I think these associations are incredibly powerful for people.
Yep. So I just noticed Eileen Yi put in the chat window, Julie, I love your account of why people may feel they have different personalities in their different languages. Eileen Yi is one of the researchers that worked with Julie. She got her PhD with Julie as advisor.
Yeah, and I'm sure is familiar with the bicultural context as well. Yeah.
In the Q&A, we've got a question from Haynes Elizabeth. She asks, I am struck by some friends whose children always speak to them in L1 and others who don't. As an SLP, we often recommend parents' input in L1 and accept child's output in L1, English or mixed. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be the case that families were often pressured to not speak their first language at home in the interests of assimilating the child quickly into English and preparing them for school. That is less and less the case. Individual families vary dramatically as to what they speak at home. I think a big factor is whether both partners speak the same language. But I think we also don't have quite enough awareness and education for families who might want to maintain a degree of bilingualism as to the best ways to go about that. So if we kind of bring back the analogy of you have to support all of the children in the household in all of the languages, I think it's not really well understood by many families the degree to which that first language is going to be fragile. It's not well understood just how much input is required to solidly acquire it, and how much those children are going to need to have some contact with the language outside of their own household in order to be able to maintain it. So it's often not enough for parents to speak to their child in that language if there's no further support. You mentioned Klingon, Michael, and I'm reminded of an anecdote I heard recently of a family, a couple who were Klingon speakers and decided they were going to raise their child in Klingon. So they spoke to the kid in Klingon. Kid spoke Klingon until the age of 5, and then he goes to school and guess what? Stops speaking Klingon. Yep. Because he very quickly learns that that marks him as different from his peers. It's not a language that is spoken or valued out in the world. And you can't simply download a language into a child's mind and have it stay there. It's a living thing. It has to be nurtured. It has to be kept alive. And I really wish that we became a little bit more aware in even societies that purport to be multicultural, just how much extra support is needed in order to really maintain a stable bilingualism in these families.
Yeah, I think inside a mind and across a whole society, an individual language is like a product in the market or a company in a free market. And if one language starts running the show and developing a monopoly, then it can completely squeeze out all other competitors. If you have no regulations on that market, that free market will fill up with a monopoly, like it usually does. And we've learned that in economics, how you have to have some kind of regulations to keep competition and have the diversity that makes you have a strength. Without that diversity, you're missing out on a certain strength you could have in that mind and in that society.
Yeah. So our policies have to reflect the statements that we make about valuing these languages. I think in the United States, it's more of an uphill battle because there's not a consensus that this is a valuable thing to have within our society. And I think it comes from a misperception of the degree of threat that English is under, when really, when you look at the evidence, it could not be less threatened than it is. English is so absolutely securely entrenched within the minds and hearts of North American speakers. Yeah, absolutely. There's a place in the book actually where I refer to a researcher who's made the analogy of language as a virus, which I think is kind of an interesting idea because what it gets right, I think, is the idea that languages spread through social contact, and the degree to which a language will spread and become dominant depends on the patterns of social interactions that you see among its speakers. So if that language is limited to a group of people who are in a bubble and don't interact with others, that language is not going to spread, just as we know that a virus won't spread among a self-contained group of people who limit their interactions with anybody outside of that group. So I think it's an interesting metaphor that gives a little bit of insight into how languages operate in our societies. But of course, it does miss a few things. One of those being that, unlike, say, the coronavirus, a language is really hard to catch, like really difficult to catch. You need sustained, prolonged interaction with speakers of the language in order to acquire it. And I think that most people don't identify with viruses that come into their bodies the way that they identify with languages that set up camp in their minds. So it's a limited metaphor, but I think a very interesting one.
I think it was in the 1970s that William S. Burroughs first wrote that. He said, language is a virus. Playfully wrote, language is a virus brought here from outer space. It was how he described it. Sometimes it feels like that.
Well, I think it's something that just springs from our human nature.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, but it is fundamentally a social thing. It's not simply, a way of encoding information. It arises out of our social interactions. When without social interactions, there's no transmission of language.
In the Q&A, Claudia Green has a question. She says, Julie, thank you for speaking tonight. Did your mother seem to be eager to assimilate herself as you were growing up? Did she speak English well, and was she encouraging her children to?
Yeah, so I think you picked up on the hints that my father was the one who was a little bit more linguistically, I guess, rooted in his Czech language. Was my mother more eager to assimilate? I'm not sure that she was necessarily more eager to assimilate, but for whatever reason, I think she adapted to English more readily. So one of the interesting findings that I came across is studies that showed that in adulthood, there's a lot more variability in the degree to which people acquire a language that they learn late in life. So, generally, we all become very competent speakers of the language that we learn as children if we continue to speak it. But if we learn a language late in life, some people will learn it quickly and well, and others painfully and slowly, and will reach a ceiling beyond which they can't seem to progress. Some of that seems to be related perhaps to the fact that linguistic aptitude is more important for adult learners of language than child learners of language. So I think that my parents simply differed in the ability to learn English quickly and easily. At some point, my mother actually enrolled in a university program, so she got a degree. So she was immersed in a way of using English to talk about abstract ideas, to discuss things at a level of sophistication that increasingly, as we got older, we wanted to be able to talk to our parents about. My father struggled with that more for whatever reason. And I think, this is one of the heartbreaks that I see in many families whose generations straddle languages, is that much as they might want to adapt to the new language, they might be facing certain biologically imposed limitations in their ability to acquire that language with any proficiency. So if the next generation is not well rooted within the language, there can be really serious communication gaps between parents and kids. And it is absolutely heartbreaking.
These are excellent questions coming in the Q&A. It's a very interactive crowd. An anonymous attendee asks, the emphasis in your presentation thus far regards your departure from your Czech past. However, to what extent have changes in Czech in the intervening period represented Czech drifting away from you?
I'm guessing that this person is referring to changes in the Czech language, but also there have been changes in the Czech culture as well. I think many immigrant communities have the feeling that that they represent a slice of their culture and language that maybe is rooted in the past, and then things go on without them. That was especially true in my family's history. Because of the impossibility of traveling back and forth. So my family left at a time when the country was not an open society. We left as refugees and were not permitted to come back in the country, or if we did, we risked actually being imprisoned for having left illegally. So when my family left, it was with the understanding that they might never return. And communication with family members back there was extremely limited. Many families now return to their home country every year or very regularly. So they're more able to keep in touch with with the developments in the language and culture. I would say that yes, that definitely contributed to my sense of alienation from Czech society. And now, as I'm making some more significant efforts at spending more time in the country, re-immersing myself there, listening to podcasts, watching TV shows, I'm realizing like, oh yeah, okay, I'm having to adapt to some of these things about Czech language and society that don't seem that familiar to me. So it's kind of an interesting experience.
Here's another good question from the Q&A that I think you'll sink your teeth into. Do you think that this is a Jacek Doniek? Hope that's an okay pronunciation. Do you think that languages that are spoken in cultures that have different political and social systems, for example, Eastern Europe, are not very fitting in American culture with the cult of individualism and less robust social structures? How should the native speakers go through the process of advancing the language to be more fitting into the English-speaking culture? And do you think that native speakers should be concerned about fitting their language to a new environment?
Excellent question. And again, here, I think language and culture are somewhat conflated because it's not just about the language, it's really about the culture that's associated with it. So it's interesting that Jacek brings up the notion of individualism, because one of the studies I talk about in the book is this really intriguing study that was done in the Netherlands, where they had Dutch-English bilinguals play a version of a game that allowed them to choose either a competitive strategy or a cooperative strategy. And when the participants played the game in Dutch, they were more likely to choose the cooperative strategy than when they played the game in English. And interestingly, this only applied to those bilinguals who had spent time in an English-speaking country. So it's not just that English is inherently a more individualistic language. It's that these people, by virtue of having had experiences in an English-speaking country, associated the English language with a more individualistic culture. So to get back to the question of how do we fit these together, I think that one of the great challenges for people who are bilingual and bicultural is to kind of constantly resolve the tensions between the two. There are many times when those two are in opposition to each other. And this comes with certain difficulties. I think that one of the great reasons to maintain and support bilingualism is precisely because it allows people to shift between cultural perspectives. And I think this is an incredibly healthy thing to be able to do, particularly in our day and age where we're seeing such extreme trends of polarization, where there's such a dramatic inability for people to perceive perspectives other than their own. There are a number of studies that suggest that bilingual and bicultural people are generally better at doing this. And furthermore, that when they present themselves to the world as being people whose two cultures are sometimes in opposition with each other, sometimes conflict with each other, but are not fundamentally irreconcilable, that this softens the stereotypes that people have of those groups. So there was one study that was done in Israel, for example, where Jewish subjects were presented with profiles of Israeli Arabs who wrote little bios of themselves and talked about how they felt connected both to Israeli culture and to Arab culture. And after reading these profiles, the subjects tended to orient less towards policies that were very punitive towards Arabs. There was a greater entertainment that people from that culture actually could have something in common with themselves. So I think people who struggle with this kind of integration have a really important role to play in society, and in a way can serve as a model for how it is that you allow competing and conflicting worldviews to sit side by side, to not always converge in agreement, but to be able to continue to live with each other.
I think the next question in the Q&A follows that kind of nicely with a concrete recommendations. Cheryl Melnick writes, I note that many of my students who are new Canadians have one foot in their native language and one foot in English. What advice would you give them to to deal with that best?
To embrace it,
Yep.
to embrace it. And I think one thing that educators could do that's really powerful, beyond simply telling families, it's great for you to speak your language at home. Implicit there is that home is the place to speak it, right? And what educators can do is to say that that language can have a role to play out in the world. So there's a really interesting trend in education circles now that's called translanguaging. And what that does is kind of embraces and acknowledges the fact that kids come into the classroom with many different linguistic backgrounds. The teacher may not know those languages, but they can still create space for them. So imagine, for instance, an activity where you're making Mother's Day cards. Well, doesn't it make sense to make a Mother's Day card for your mother in your mother's language, rather than composing a little poem in English? You know, this is something that would never have occurred in my years when I was going to school. Nobody would ever have encouraged me to write a poem to my mom in Czech. But this kind of willingness and openness to having kids develop skills of literacy in their languages where it's appropriate, I think is a really powerful signal that says, yeah, bring that language into this setting too. Kids can be taught to use research resources in their mother tongues and to integrate that with the research that they do in English so that they fluidly move back and forth between languages and don't have to keep one language in a private domestic space and use the other language in public spaces.
And the other students who may not know that other language will get to see the teacher foregrounding this and have, this
Exactly.
student wrote a poem to her mom in her native language or whatever. We're going to share it with the class a little bit and she can talk about it. And
Exactly.
then if those kids are seeing this language be respected by the teacher, then that can make them hopefully start to respect it instead of put a stigma on it.
Precisely. And it reduces the sense of threat that I think is very natural for people to have when they hear a language they can't understand. Right. So that is, I think, a normal human reaction that with exposure, that threat lessens. And teachers can play a really important role in reducing that. Absolutely. And I see that Billy says, I love the cover of your book. Did you design it? No, that is not in my skill set, but I love this cover. I love this cover so much. And when I saw it, I just felt, that, oh, you get me. The designer really got what I was trying to do with the book. And I learned yesterday that there's actually a Twitter account, an Instagram account that is devoted entirely to envisioning book covers as versions of Taylor Swift. And this cover has in fact been paired with a photograph of Taylor Swift representing the colors and the mood. So
congratulations, that's fantastic.
Yeah, if you look for Taylor Swift as books, you can see this cover rendered as a Taylor Swift photo.
Very nice.
But yeah, it's a lovely cover.
Did you have multiple options to choose among from this designer and you chose this one, or it was just
this was the first one they presented to me, and I could not imagine a more wonderful cover.
Perfect.
Yeah, it was not what I would have imagined, when I was dreaming of what the cover would look like, but as soon as I saw it, I thought it was perfect. So yes, thank you, Harvard University Press. I think we're getting close to our, oh my goodness, it's 8 o'clock already. Time has flown. Ellie, is it time for us to be wrapping up?
Hi, it is. I'm sorry, my video wouldn't start there for a second, but it's working now. Hi, everybody. I am back. We've rounded out our hour. So many wonderful questions this evening. Thank you, audience. So I am going to go ahead and take this last couple of moments to just say one huge thank you. Authors, speakers, thank you so much. This was such an incredible presentation. Audience members, thank you so much for tuning in. We're so happy to have you here. You asked such great questions. It was so great to see. I'm going to you know what? I'm going to go and link this book again one more time, so nobody has to scroll up. It looks like there's been some action in chat. So if you would like to get your hands on a copy of Memory Speaks, go ahead and follow that link. Or of course, if you're local, come on in. We'd love to see you. Let us know what you thought of this event, either in person or online. 100% always love to hear from you. Michael and Julie, huge thank you for being here and for sharing your work with us. This has been such an absolute pleasure. Do you have any last things that you'd like to say before we say goodnight?
Just want to express my appreciation to everyone who joined us tonight for the great questions. And if we didn't get to any questions, or if you think of questions that occur to you after, please don't hesitate to reach out through my website and send me a question, and I will do my best to answer it.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So let's just say one more huge thank you. And shall we let the awkward waving commence?
All right, then. Awkward waving is beginning. Bye, everyone.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.